Citizen Business Center. Now, the world's attention will next week be on Nairobi as Kenya's capital hosts the 10th Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization, making Kenya the first African country to host the conference. The meeting is seen as crucial to the conclusion of trade talks that have been dragging on since the year 2001 under what is officially referred to as the Doha Round, to enable more developing countries to participate in global trade. But first, here are some basic facts about the WTO and the state of global trade. The WTO was formed in 1995, taking over from the now defunct General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and as at the 30th of November this year, the global trade body had 162 members. Two more countries, that's Liberia and Afghanistan, are expected to join the WTO during next week's ministerial conference. According to the latest numbers from the WTO, $18 trillion US worth of goods were traded in 2014, which works out to a mind-boggling 1.8 quadrillion shillings worth of trade. The world's biggest exporters in 2014 were China, the United States of America, Germany, Japan and the Netherlands. The world's top importers, on the other hand, were the United States of America, China, Germany, Japan and the United Kingdom. Developed economies' share of global trade stood at 54%, with 44% being the contribution of developing and less developed economies. Africa's share of global trade stood at a paltry 3%. Now, indeed, Africa will be high on the agenda at the WTO conference. That's next week. Early this week, the WTO Director General Roberto Azevedo gave his expectations of the conference and what Africa can expect to reap from the meeting. Let's take a listen.
Now, it is essential that WTO members agree some meaningful outcomes in Nairobi, particularly outcomes which will deliver for Africa. And there is a lot on the table. For example, there are some big agriculture and development issues on the table. WTO members are now discussing some important potential deliverables in those areas, including measures on export competition in agriculture, as well as a set of measures aimed at boosting the least developed countries' capacity to trade. Agreement on these issues alone would represent a significant outcome for Africa and for developing nations around the world. When I think of Africa, I think of its dynamism. I think about the sense of energy and the sense of purpose that I find in every African leader or business person that I meet. Africa has the youngest population and the highest growth. And I think Africa's potential is unmatched. And I think that trade has a crucial role to play in helping to realize this potential. So I do hope that some of that energy and dynamism will inspire WTO members when they gather in Nairobi in just a few days' time.
All right, and joining us now to discuss global trade and Africa's position is Dr. Mukhisa Kituyi, of course, a former trade minister in the government of Kenya and currently the Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, that's UNCTAD. Thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight, Dr. Mukhisa Kituyi. Of course, the country has been chosen to host yet another event next year, which is why you were here in the first place. Do tell us a little bit about that before we delve into the main issues.
Yes, you know, 3 years ago, it was decided at Doha that the 14th conference of UNCTAD was going to be held in Peru. But because of some reasons, the candidature of Peru could not be sustained. Now, over the past half year, we've been looking at other candidates who wanted to host the conference, starting with Cuba and then 4 countries in Europe. Cuba could not satisfy the conditions that we gave to them, and I could not allow a developed country to host a conference traditionally held in the developing world. So luckily we found the bid offered by Kenya very good, and so Kenya is going to be the first country ever in our 52 years history to host UNCTAD conference 2 times. The last hosted in 1976, UNCTAD 4. This is a major one. This is much bigger than the WTO meeting you're having next week. WTO is bringing to town about 1,500 people. UNCTAD 14 has a high-level segment with up to 20 presidents from around the world, more than 100 ministers. Then together with it, we're having the World Investment Forum, the 5th World Investment Forum, with Forbes 500 CEOs, and we're having the Global Commodities Forum. So this is major, about 6,500 people coming. And unlike WTO, where ministers after the ceremonial opening will be locked in a room to try to agree what concessions to make on a matter that has been going on since Doha in 2001. Our meeting has a number of different fora at which we will have both negotiations, but mostly consultations, presentations, and open discourse with civil society, academia, and government leaders.
And of course, I'll want to delve into the issues of discussions behind doors that have happened in the past and how that affects trade today and going forward. But first, I'd like to ask you, so we're hosting WTO, and then we have the UNCTAD conference as well coming up. What do these events mean for Kenya?
A number of things. First of all, of course, over the past 10 years, Kenya has steadily grown as an effective competitor with South Africa on conference tourism on the continent. Particularly this past year, when you've had President Obama and this team, you've had UNCTAD, the WTO meeting coming up next week. You are having TCAD coming up next year, and you're having UNCTAD 14. These are major events. Most countries will celebrate to have one of those in 2 years, but you are putting all of them in one 12-month period. So very, very substantial vote of confidence for conference logistics. Secondly, it's a vote of confidence for stability in a country for such major conference to go ahead and be held successfully. And third, it's a major fillip for the struggling tourism industry, that we bring a substantial number of people from around the world. I was addressing all colleagues and the Secretaries General from the United Nations last week, and I was telling them our conference will end the weekend that the Great Migration starts in Emara, and there will be substantial numbers of people will be exposed to this possibility with a multiplier effect. So there are many different components. But most importantly, you are at the center of thought leadership and public discourse, which is very important. And I welcome departure or refrain from your traditional political combat that you carry on every year in the country.
All right, let's talk about trade from a global perspective just for an instance. And common consensus is that when it comes to trade, it's a big against a small. There's no such thing as balanced trade where global trade is concerned. And I'm just wondering, we're having all these events coming up. Global trade is certainly at the center of modern day discussions. But are these all talk shops?
No. Trade as an enabler for development is not in dispute. There are not many cases of countries which have done very well internationally, grown out of poverty, without substantial engagement in export-driven trade. Secondly, creating the route of investment into productive capacity improvement, triggering structural transformation because of taking human labor into more higher value products than the traditional subsistence agriculture, for example, is a known path for development. So the challenge is, how do governments structure such policies coherence between economic planning, agriculture, science and technology, and trade to be pulling in the same direction to maximize what comes out of trade? For example, Kenya, the biggest trade phenomenon in Kenya is actually services industry. Tourism, telecommunications, financial services, audit services, logistics services. These are major contributors to the economy. But how much do you put them at the mainstream, at the center of planning your national goals and aspirations and allocation of public resources? This is what is important. Small countries have benefited from trade. Mauritius is now an emerging economy. 20 years ago, it was totally dependent on sugarcane and a declining wheat crop because of the strong cyclones that it was in the path of. But it has moved very quickly into services, investing into financial services as a major center. As an example, this country and a lot of other countries, East Africa, can trade out of poverty. What kind of services do you see Kenya having muscle in? You know, you have muscle, but it weakens every time you sit and become complacent. Your value-added services in telecommunications have been world-class, particularly on mobile money. But secondly, you have very, very fundamental quality product in tourism industry, in financial services, in accounting and audit services. And you see increasingly these services going upstream even for industrial purposes. Industrialization does not mean going into manufacture alone. It also entails the higher services, higher value services that service manufacturing and trade. You have the capacity, you have the geographical location, you have the emerging infrastructure to build upon this as one of the main levers of economic recovery.
And of course, agriculture, albeit, and has been said over and over again, that the dependence on agriculture by Africa is one of the reasons why Africa is where it is today. But truth be told, the majority of Africans still depend on it, and it provides a majority to our GDP.
Agriculture will continue being important for Africa, for Kenya, and for the whole region. The main thing is, what form of agriculture? In the 21st century, the low-quality, traditional subsistence agriculture that we have been brought up and seeing as agriculture is not viable. It is holding down a large population with very little value addition to the national economy. So investment in mechanizing, industrializing agriculture, from the production of quality inputs to the improvement of husbandry methods, to streamlining storage infrastructure, predictable market conditions, and state support. There is no country which industrialized agriculture.
Let's talk about state support. Let's talk about that.
That's where you should be going.
What kind of state support should we expect in agriculture?
There are a number of areas you expect state support in agriculture. First of all, assist in the production of low-cost factor products for production. Number one, fertilizer. It's too late in the day for countries like these to be importing fertilizer. I was glad to hear recently that there's other plans to put up a fertilizer factory in Eldoret. I hope that works, and I hope it is done transparently and cost-effectively. Secondly, transport infrastructure in the main producing areas. Number three, when I was a little boy, there were foot soldiers of agriculture who trained farmers about husbandry.
Extension officers.
Extension officers are necessary to come back to improve the productivity of farms. Improved storage, clear marketing strategy. Now, that now brings us to WTO. I listened to my colleague Azevedo talking about export support being removed as a way of helping Africa. That's partly true, but that's not the full story. What has been holding back WTO Doha round since Doha in 2001 is the fact that Europe and America are saying we have committed to a round which is supposed to help make rules that benefit the trade for development in the poorest countries. Africa has been waiting, not about export support, which is important, but about domestic support in their markets. So
they're still over-subsidizing
the massive subsidy to farmers in the European Union and in America excludes the possibility of African farmers exporting what they are capable of producing into those markets. So apart from just saying we are opening the doors to you,
contentious point for you?
It's not. I have not seen anything about what is contentious to me. I have spoken on behalf of African ministers. I was addressing African ministers, ACP ministers of trade 3 weeks ago in Brussels, and I've been telling them it is up to them to maximize what they can harvest. But what I'm emphasizing is export support is the only thing that the European Union and Americans are putting on the table for Nairobi. But Africa has been asking more for removal of domestic support than export support. So without sufficient movement on domestic subsidies in the rich countries, there is limited impetus they create for greater export of African agricultural produce. Which is one of the main reasons we think Africa should be engaged in rule-making on trade and agriculture.
Would I be wrong to say that next week you'd probably walk out of one of the meetings?
I am too big to do that kind of thing. I used to do that in my earlier life. Today I'm not into walking out. As a matter of fact, I'm not a negotiator.
Yes.
This is a negotiation between trade ministers.
Yes.
I am here on a number of things. You know, when we have world meetings, the ecosystem allows for a lot of different discourse around development questions. So on the margins of the negotiations on paragraphs and lines and translations that will be going on in KICC, we have a lot of other major activities going on. For example, I'm co-hosting a discussion with the Secretary General of the Commonwealth on building productive capacity. I'm co-hosting a session with Trademark East Africa on regional integration. I'm co-hosting a session with the Vice Chair of African Union Commission on Pan-African Free Trade Area, the CFTA, the Continental Free Trade Area. I'm co-hosting with the Minister of International Cooperation of the Netherlands a session where we are going live on e-platform, electronic registration and regulation of trade in Kenya, something we have been building for Kenya Investment Authority over the past 1 year. So we have a lot of other activities going on the margins. I have at least two events every day, including the launch of the World Innovation Report, which I'll be doing from Nairobi during this conference. So there's a lot to go on, but I'm not in reverse gear. I just encourage that African ministers identify what's important for Africa. Separate between the rhetoric. Then sometimes they will be telling them, hata mkia ni nyama. You know, you have gotten export support, so you should be comfortable. But tell them, take it in your stride. But is this all you are looking for?
Are you confident that the African position is coherent this time around?
They have made a substantial effort, and thanks partly to Minister Ambassador Mina, who has been very much backstopping the African team's consultations in Geneva on the road to Nairobi. There is emerging very clear position of the African ministers on a number of key things, but there's a lot of other things that are not yet sorted out. I know on Tuesday I'm having a meeting with the ministers of trade from African, Caribbean and Pacific countries. They are still looking to firm our positions, seeing what offers are viable and what is sufficient in return. So the process continues, and it will go on beyond Nairobi.
As we wind up, Dr. Kituyi, what would a balanced trade environment be for the global economy?
There will never be a totally balanced environment. But if you ask me, what should be the key interests of African countries today be? A number of key areas are important to me. Number one, over the past 2 years, developing Africa has been borrowing very, very massively on the bonds market. It portends positive and negative. Positive because with the ambitions of the Agenda 2030, no country is going to be raising sufficient resources from its traditional donors and from its taxpayers. So for some of the infrastructure, for example, you will need certain borrowing from abroad. But negative because the bond market is a vulture's market. It does not have any sympathy with developing countries. We are at a time when two things have happened. Number one, commodity prices globally have collapsed over the past 2 years. They are not showing any clear signs of substantial recovery. And number two, Africa's bond market borrowing in the past 2 years has moved from about $5.5 billion to about $12 billion. Much of it above average European bond rates. Countries like Ghana recently borrowing at nearly 20%. Now, the problem is, when the Federal Reserve raises interest rates in the USA, the vulture funds and speculators behind bond funds start raising interest on their lent money. Some start withdrawing because they want to invest in the more secure US Treasury paper. The consequence is a strain even on countries that don't have a very, very large borrowed money compared to GDP. But countries like Kenya, for example, you have now reached 62% of GDP in foreign debt. That is not sustainable unless commodity prices rise. But also, countries should never borrow money abroad for recurrent expenditure. Borrow for development that can raise more to pay back with interest and still leave a value. But recurrent expenditure does not yield any value that can pay debts that you incur internationally. So that's one level of concern. But on trade matters, governments must find a way of relating the education system, the economic policies, science and technology and innovation, and trade out of poverty. Include more people, particularly in the disadvantaged areas, in finding the benefit of participating in trade. And not just trade of being merchants of Chinese imports. Traders who are adding value to made in Kenya for export elsewhere.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us on the show this evening. Dr. Mukhisa Kituyi, Secretary General of UNCTAD, was joining us to talk about global trade and Africa's position.